Black asphalt unwound under a bruised sky. Stars, faint pinpricks, offered no comfort. Only the drone of the engine filled the vast emptiness.
Another all-nighter, another desolate stretch of Route 66.
Frank gripped the steering wheel, knuckles bone white. Frank wasn't alone. Miles back, hauling his own load of darkness, was Pete. They weren't friends, not really. Just two souls thrown together by the lonely rhythm of the road. They spoke in grunts and shrugs at fuel stops, sharing cigarettes and weary silences. Tonight, though, the silence felt different, heavier.
Come on, Pete, you out there?
Frank flicked on the CB radio, static hissing like a venomous snake. He tried Pete's frequency, only the static answered. He tried again and again. Each attempt was met with the same frustrating silence, the static crackling like a mocking laugh in his ears. Frank's fingers trembled as he adjusted the dials, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. Then a voice, thin and reedy, cut through the static, sending a shiver down his spine. It was a voice he didn't recognize, one that seemed to carry an otherworldly chill.
Frank?
It wasn't Pete. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and Frank's blood turned to ice. He had been expecting the familiar, reassuring voice of his friend, but this was something else entirely.
Who's this?
He choked out, his voice a dry rasp. The words felt heavy, as if they were being dragged out of him by some unseen force. The voice on the other end chuckled, a chilling, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confined space of the truck cabin.
Just a fellow traveler. You're on the devil's stretch now, Frankie. Better be careful. The words were laced with a sinister undertone, and Frank felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach.
Frank slammed the CB off, heart hammering against his ribs. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it was a relief compared to the eerie voice that had just spoken to him. His rig suddenly felt cold, the air thick with unseen menace. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the truck felt like a whisper of doom. He pushed on, ignoring the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but the unease was growing, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He told himself it was just a prank, a cruel joke from some bored locals, but the words felt hollow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. It took root in his mind, growing with each passing mile, each minute of silence. The road stretched on, a black ribbon against the encroaching darkness. The headlights of his truck barely pierced the inky blackness, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. Hours crawled by, each mile marked by growing dread. The landscape around him seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against the windows of his cab. He tried Pete's frequency again. Silence. Just the hiss of static and the gnawing fear in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was out there in the darkness, waiting for him. Frank's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any sign of movement. The fear was palpable, a living thing that seemed to wrap itself around him, squeezing tighter with each passing second. He thought he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, just at the edge of his headlight's reach. But when he looked again, it was gone, swallowed by the night. With a shaking hand, he reached for the CB radio again, hoping against hope that Pete would answer this time. The static hissed back at him, a cruel reminder of his isolation. The road ahead was empty, a desolate stretch of asphalt that seemed to go on forever. Frank felt a wave of despair wash over him, the weight of the unknown pressing down on his shoulders, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving, had to find out what was happening. The fear was still there, but so was a grim determination. He would get through this, no matter what. As the truck drove into the darkness, its headlights cutting through the night, Frank steeled himself for whatever lay ahead. The whispers on the CB might have shaken him, but they wouldn't break him. Not yet. Headlights flickered in the distance, cutting through the thick veil of night. A lone figure stood by the roadside, thumb outstretched, a silent plea for a ride. The night was cold, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. A woman, her face obscured by shadow, emerged from the darkness. Frank, a seasoned truck driver, hesitated. He had heard countless stories of the dangers lurking in the night, tales of deceit and peril. Frank hesitated, a lifetime of warnings echoing in his head. Yet, the loneliness of the long road was a powerful force, gnawing at his resolve. He pulled over, the truck's engine rumbling softly in the stillness. The woman slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her a scent of rain and something else, something faintly metallic. It was an odd combination, one that sent a shiver down Frank's spine. The scent lingered in the confined space of the truck cabin, mixing with the smell of old leather and diesel. Frank glanced at her, trying to make out her features in the dim light. She didn't speak, just stared ahead, her eyes two dark, empty sockets in the gloom. It was as if she was looking at something far beyond the confines of the truck, something only she could see.
Where you headed? Frank's voice broke the silence, a tentative attempt to connect.
He asked. The woman didn't answer. Her silence was heavy, almost tangible, filling the space between them. She simply pointed a pale finger toward the road ahead. Frank followed her gaze, his curiosity piqued and his unease growing. There, at the edge of the headlights, stood a lone figure, Pete. Frank's heart skipped a beat. Pete was his old friend, a fellow trucker who had vanished without a trace years ago. Frank slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. The tires screeched against the asphalt, the sound echoing in the desolate night. He turned, heart pounding, to look at his passenger. His mind raced with questions and fear, but the seat beside him was empty. The woman had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Empty, save for a faint indentation in the worn leather and the lingering scent of rain and rust. Frank sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The night seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing against the windows of the truck. He looked out into the night, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The encounter left him with more questions than answers, a mystery that would haunt him for years to come. The vanishing hitchhiker, a ghostly presence on the lonely roads, a reminder of the unknown that lurks in the shadows. As Frank drove away, the taillights of his truck fading into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just brushed against the supernatural. The road was long, and the night was full of secrets. Frank's face, illuminated by the dashboard lights, was etched with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The vanishing hitchhiker was now a part of his story, a chilling chapter in the life of a trucker. The empty road stretched out before him, the night sky filled with stars, each one a silent witness to the mysteries of the night. And somewhere out there, the vanishing hitchhiker continued her silent journey, a spectral figure on the endless road. Pete sat hunched over a cup of coffee, the Greasy Spoon Diner a meager island of light in the ocean of darkness. He hadn't seen Frank in days. The radio silence was unnerving. He took another gulp of the bitter brew, trying to ignore the cold feeling that had settled in his gut. A figure slid into the booth across from him, shrouded in shadow.
Coffee?
The voice was like sandpaper on bone. The waitress, her face a mask of indifference, refilled the cup without a word. Pete tried to ignore the newcomer, focusing on the lukewarm coffee and the greasy burger congealing on his plate. But the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the distant hum of the highway.
Heard about your friend?
Pete's head snapped up.
What friend?
His voice was tight. The figure chuckled, a dry, rattling sound.
The one who picked up the wrong hitchhiker.
The diner seemed to grow colder, the air thick with unspoken menace. The flickering neon sign outside cast a ghostly glow through the windows, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The few patrons who were there seemed to huddle closer to their meals, as if trying to ward off the chill that had suddenly descended upon the room. The figure pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, tossing it onto the table with a casual flick of the wrist. The sound of the bill hitting the table seemed to echo louder than it should have, drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. Conversations halted, and all eyes turned towards the source of the disturbance.
This was all he had left. The bill, stained with blood, was a grim reminder of everything he had lost. It wasn't just money. It was a symbol of a life that had been violently torn apart.
The voice was a low hiss. Pete stared at the bill, his mind racing with memories and questions. Who had left it here and why? The bloodstains told a story of violence and desperation, but the details were maddeningly out of reach. It was stained crimson, the ink swirling around a name scrawled on the back. Frank's name. Pete's heart skipped a beat. Frank had been his best friend, his confidant. Seeing his name on the bill brought a flood of emotions, grief, anger, and a burning need for answers. He reached for the bill, his fingers trembling. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had to know what had happened to Frank, and this bill was the only clue he had. As he touched the blood-stained paper, a wave of dizziness washed over him. It was as if the bill carried with it the echoes of the past, pulling him into a vortex of memories and emotions. He saw Frank's truck, careening off the road, headlights flashing in a desperate dance of death. The image was so vivid, it was as if he were there, witnessing the tragedy unfold in real time. He heard the screech of metal, the shattering of glass, the gut-wrenching thud of impact. Each sound was a dagger to his heart, a painful reminder of the moment his life had changed forever. Then, silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm, leaving behind a void that can never be filled. The aftermath of the accident was a desolate landscape, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. The figure was gone. The diner was empty, save for Pete and the indifferent waitress wiping down the counter. She seemed oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded, her mind occupied with mundane tasks. He stumbled out into the night, the blood-stained bill clutched in his hand. The cool night air hit him like a slap, bringing him back to the present. But the questions remained, gnawing at him with relentless persistence. The highway stretched before him, a dark and unforgiving path. It seemed to go on forever, a never-ending journey into the unknown. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the burden of his memories and the mystery that lay ahead. He had never felt so alone. The darkness seemed to close in around him, a suffocating presence that mirrored the emptiness inside him. But he knew he couldn't turn back. He had to find out what had happened to Frank, no matter where the road might lead.